Awesome. Okay. Let's pray. Wow. What craziness. There we go. Cool. Yeshua, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for this song. Thank you for your kindness, for your love. I ask that you would bless us. I ask that we would just be devoted to you alone. I ask that we would fall in love with you. I ask that nothing else would matter, not our passions, not our agendas, not our pride, not our longings, not our yearnings, not our fears, but that we would count everything as dung in comparison to knowing you, Mashiach. So I just ask you to bless this time. Help us to work through the song. Guide us. In Yeshua's name, amen. Okay, so we are in Isaiah 53:1. Now, a lot of people, this is what they think of when they think of the servant song. It's just Isaiah 53. They don't typically pay attention to the fact that the song goes back 3 verses into 52, right? Where we have Hine, behold, that breaks up that structure, and it's 52:13 all the way to 53:12. So people tend to think of this verse because it's the opening of the chapter, and when they think of the sacrifice of Mashiach as prophesied by the prophets, they tend to think of Isaiah 53. So this verse is very helpful. It's quoted by Paul in Romans. It is a key passage to understanding the role of this servant figure that is prophesied by the prophet Isaiah. So what you can see right here, the dynamic translation that I can use my mouse here. You can see here the dynamic translation, okay, that I've made prior. Why don't you read that out loud? It's in English, and then I'll read the Hebrew.
Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of Yahweh been revealed?
Okay, so that's the LEB, which is fine. It's like bad formatting. I've got them butted up against each other. That's typically how it's worded. Over here with the star over in my messy formatting, who heard is, and I actually can highlight it. That would have been probably more helpful for you. This right here is the dynamic translation. It'll help unpack the Hebrew. So go ahead and read that.
Who heard a report and judged him faithful? Who actually believed what they were hearing from us? Who was let in on it? And who could actually see what the arm of Yahweh was up to?
Okay, cool. Sorry, I also highlighted the phrase dynamic translation of servant song. Good job not reading that. I'm reminded of the YouTube video. Look at that horse. Okay. All right. So the Hebrew, Miha min lishmotenu. Uzroya almi niglata. Okay. Me in Hebrew, this is like who's on first base. Me in Hebrew is the word for who. So who who has deemed faithful. Okay. From the shoresh, this is where we get the phrase amen or amen, right? And for some reason, now I cannot. Let's do it. Let's see this. Can I do it? Are you going to work with me? You're not going to work with me, are you? Okay, that's weird. Get that out of there. I'm going to write down the shoresh here so we can see it. I got you right here. I'm going to make your letters thicker, and then you should be cooperating. Let's see. And we're going to make you larger. There we go. Okay, helpful. All right, so we have this root. It's over here, ha'amin. Okay, breaking this down bit by bit. And you can see 3 letters in it, okay? This is where we get amen. Aman is the verb, okay? And it means it's to hold, to be durable, to be steadfast, to be faithful, to support, okay? To support. This hey, which is this letter right here, I'll write it next to it so we can see how this thing is conjugated. All right, we've got a hey right here with a sigil, a tough sigil. Okay, that hey added to this root is causal. it's the he feel format in Hebrew. It means it's not just to be support or to be faithful, but it's to cause to support or to cause to be faithful. In other words, to deem faithful or to judge faithful. Hence, the translation here, judged him faithful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Miha amin lishmuatenu. Okay. Now, why did I supply the word him? The reason I supplied the word him is because we know from the prior verses that's discussing the servant. We know the next verse is discussing the servant. Whoever our is interesting. We don't exactly know who we are. Okay, the we in the first person plural sense that has a message. Our message. We don't know who that is. We have good indication, at the very least, starting with Isaiah, that it is at least Isaiah and God. Okay, possibly Isaiah and God and the servant. It's also possible to say it's Isaiah and his disciples, his Talmidim, which are mentioned in chapter 8. It's our message; those were faithful to him. Okay, and it is possible that our message is Yahweh, the servant, Isaiah, and his disciples. Okay, because the servant is going to take on an Isaianic role, a role like the prophet Isaiah, it could be collapsed to say these are the disciples of the servant. Similarly to the disciples of Isaiah spreading their message. Okay. Mm-hmm. But it should also include, I think, Isaiah. You can see the plasticity within the entire work of Isaiah. Isaiah is a sweeping, massive work. And all of these figures are key players. And because you're going to see the speaker identify with the nation of Israel, okay, you know that there are some Israelite core of faithful that are entrusted, or at the very least, without saying faithful, there is a group of Israelites that are entrusted with a message to take to Israel, okay, that God has, in part, orchestrated, authored, brought to pass, okay, which is why the next phrase, Zroayah, the arm of Yahweh, who is the arm of Yahweh been revealed to? Okay, so we have this, who has believed or deemed faithful or judged faithful, our message, okay. This phrase for message is related to the verb shama, to hear, which is in our prior verse, those who didn't hear will understand. It's about the servant. So the message is pertaining to the servant. It's the message of the servant. So who has deemed him faithful is appropriate because we're saying who's deemed the servant that we're proclaiming about and putting in your ears and causing you to hear about, who's deemed him faithful? It's kind of a rhetorical question because we know from 52:13, God judges the servant as faithful. And so then the question becomes, what about us? How do we judge the servant? And that's kind of why the shift anyways from 52 into 53. 53 starts, it's like a hinge. So we're talking about the servant, but the hinge is, okay, we know how God thinks of the servant. And we know what's going to happen to far-reaching Gentiles and kings regarding the servant. But us, Israel, how did we think about the servant? That's why this question is poignant and heartbreaking, because it's like, who? Is anybody believed? Is anybody deemed unfaithful? I want to say there's a hint, first off, that this is a rhetorical question, and it's a hint in the negative, meaning not really anybody deemed unfaithful, which is really sad. And you're going to see this treatment. He's going to unpack that statement. Because the phrase, well, why is this? First off, we know structurally we have 52, right? We have chapter 52, and then we go down to verse 13, right? And we've got 13, 14, and 15, those verses in 52, right? 13 is Yahweh's view of the servant. Behold, my servant. First person, behold, my servant. He will succeed. He will be exalted. He tells you the end. 14 talks about people were horrified at him and they leap back. 15 says kings and they'll understand. Others will understand. People who didn't see will, what's the phrase? Those who did not see, it will be told to them. Those who did not hear, they will understand, right? So we know this outcome. And then the shift into 53, the hinge is this. 53 takes us into the question of Israel. But 53:1, I want you to imagine that 53:1 is actually a ring. verse 1 is a ring. Okay? This ring is 53 verse 1. And then what we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 is contained within that ring. The first clause or half of verse 1. Okay? Let's change color so that it doesn't screw with our eyes. The first half of the ring is clause A. All right, and the second clause B. Okay, let me tell you what I mean. Clause A is who is believed our message. Rhetorical question, not really anyone. Clause B is and to whom is the arm of Yahweh been revealed. This phrase of arm of Yahweh, by the way, it means something. A lot of people are going to hear arm of Yahweh and they think, oh, because they believe that the servant was judged in the negative and punished by God, they think of the arm of Yahweh as a kind of fiery arm of vengeance and destruction. To be fair, yes, the arm of Yahweh is associated with meting out judgments on God's enemies. However, the verse prior, or the chapter prior in 52, spoke about the arm of Yahweh in verse 10, just 3 verses prior to the opening of the psalm. And the arm is spoken of as a beneficiary of Israel. That the arm of Yahweh would be exposed and made naked, revealed, and he would lead them and shepherd them in another Exodus, right? So the arm of Yahweh is a good thing and a positive thing. It's about Yahweh's victory for Israel, not about its failure. So I would argue that basically the latter, you get a lot of peppered in. So the speaker he hops around from the perspective of, in 53, okay, the speaker is one of Israel, but he hops from perspectives. He goes from the perspective of what we, Israel, thought of the servant, to what was actually happening with the servant, back to what we thought of the servant, back to what was actually happening to the servant, all the way to verse 10, where he then says, but what did God think of the servant? And then we get this exaltation language about God's judgment of the servant through healing the sickness and reversing the wounds. Okay, so that takes us through. So this verse is an introductory verse, and it provides a structure for the rest of the verses. So verse 1 will provide a structure for verses 2 through 12. So, yeah, that's a tricky shelf. It's only held up in the middle. All right, it's like a pedal. On Rumpelstiltskin's sewing machine. I'm tired too. So, Lish Moteno, okay, who has believed our message, who's deemed it faithful, who's judged him faithful. Uzroa ya almi niglata. And to whom is the arm, on whom? This is an interesting thing. Uzroa ya almi niglata. It says to whom, but actually it's on whom has the arm of Yahweh been revealed. Almost like this idea of him touching down, him overshadowing, him being there. And it is reminiscent of the Exodus and God displaying his wondrous signs and his power. And so to answer the question, because there are 2 questions, you tell me what are the 2 questions in this verse?
Who believed the message and who would the arm of Yahweh be revealed to?
Bingo. So, and it is in the past tense. So who has believed it is the first question, and who has the arm of Yahweh been revealed to is the second question. You had exactly right. Those are the 2 questions. So what I want us to think about is this, is how are we supposed to, as an audience and hearer of this ancient text, how does the narrator want us to answer those questions? Well, you have to pay careful attention to the dichotomy between us and our opinion and our thoughts of the servant, and God and his thoughts of the servant, because God represents the arm of Yah. So to understand what the arm of Yahweh has been up to, because it's hidden, the idea that it needs to be revealed means that it is sneaky and not apparent, right? If it needs to be revealed, it's not done in a way, it's done in a way that's hidden. But that's already in line with Isaiah. The whole message of Isaiah from end to end. I mean, when Yahweh commissions Isaiah in chapter 6, he says, yeah, speak in a way that you make seeing people blind. Speak in a way that you make hearing people deaf, because that's how they like it. They've taken my Torah, which is clear and light and beautiful, and they made it opaque and difficult and confusing. You want to take simple things and make them difficult and opaque. Good. I'll give you opaque, difficult things. Okay, and the servant's at the heart of that. The servant is at the heart of that. And God does this to both simultaneously expose the sickness of Israel and then simultaneously have already provided a misham for the healing of that sickness if they will only gaze at it. They will only give allegiance to the servant. Judge the servant the way God judged the servant.
Mm-hmm.
And wherein is the judgment of the servant? You're going to find that they would say, if you listen to verse 2, 3, 4, you would think that the judgment of the servant is in his beating and in his, by God's judgment of the servant, let's say it that way. Where is God's judgment of the servant to be located? If you listen to 2, 3, and 4, God's judgment of the servant is to be located in his beating and his lesions and his rejection. No, that was Israel's judgment of the servant. And they duped themselves. God's judgment of the servant is in the healing and reversal of the sicknesses and the wounds that were struck on, the blows that were struck on him, the bruises. So, to whom is the arm of Yahweh? Or sorry, who has believed our message? To whom is the arm of Yahweh been revealed? Okay, so we have stuff that you and I have gone through, in times past. You wrote down an idea, about what it means. We have a lot of questions. I think we wrote down like 30 different questions. You can start there, or you can, and I can put this link in the video for these questions, but just to refresh yourself, do you have questions or thoughts or comments that you want to share about this? Because Peter, you have been kind of trying to chew on this and study it and understand it and think about it and internalize it. So I'm curious to know, what do you think about this verse? Is there something you want to add to what's been said?
Well, on the whole, who believes the message, and he's kind of hinting at no one, but it's no one chose to on their own, and yet God still allowed or assisted or asked people to receive it and to understand it, and in so doing revealed himself to those people.
Yes.
So I don't know if they heard the message and then God was revealed to them, or if God revealed himself and that made it so they were able to understand the message.
That's a great question, because the dichotomy between that, the two sides of that, you need both. Because the aching question is this: well, what does God think about the servant? Because really, we should ask that question if any of us know Yahweh or believe in God. That should be our question about anybody, any person, anything. What is God's judgment? Right? How do I find God's judgment will be in what is the sign, the power, like what has been done to reveal God's judgment, that kind of thing. And in this sense, what's done to reveal the God's judgment of the servant it's a miracle. It's a wonder. It's a resurrection. It's a reversal of the death. He died and now he lives.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially what verse 10 starts to introduce, what verse 11 speaks about. He'll see from death, he'll see the light of life. And then he'll be exalted. Okay? That exaltation is a wonder and a sign. So let's start with the first part of your question. The rhetorical question is like, who's deemed unfaithful? Kind of nobody. And there's so much truth to that. It's horrifying and it's dark. However, the people for whom it will be the easiest to believe in the aftermath of the sign and the reversal will be the people who the fakers, the religious elite, have excluded. It'll go from the outsiders first. So we see at the end of 52, Gentiles even will be able to see this and believe. We know because the servant is associated with lepers and outcasts. Those who are outcasted, those who are lepers, they too will be able to believe. If we take into, now if we zoom out our scope past just 53 and we're like, let's widen our scope, and we include 40 to 66, for example, or even 35, Isaiah 35 to 66, we see the widow, the orphan, the poor, the reject, the filthy. These guys will have the greatest chance at recognizing, and that's a core verb here, because it's a tricky thing to say hear and see.
Mhm.
Because you can't condemn something you don't hear and see. And these guys condemn the servant, meaning they hear the servant, they see the servant, but when we say see, when we use the verb see, we just mean take in data, regardless of the judgment we make. When we use the verb recognize, which is a synonym of see, what does that mean when I say I recognize?
Recognize is a lot deeper than seeing you understand and comprehend what you're looking at.
That's right. Comprehend, much deeper. It's like seeing into the thing. Nobody saw into. They didn't recognize. So then the question becomes, okay, you're right. I actually like your dichotomy, because what it helps us do is say, like, okay, how utter, how dark, how bleak, how bad is the rejection of the servant? It's horrific, and it's to the utmost. So in some sense, he's completely alone. And that's horrific. Something's going to happen, though, where there's this dramatic reversal, just like Isaiah has spoken of. Isaiah is all about reversals. High people, you're going to be brought low. Proud people, you're going to be humiliated. Wealthy people, you're going to be poor. Poor people, you're going to be made wealthy. Ignorant people, you're going to gain knowledge, right? The learned and the discerning, it'll be hidden from you. Okay? These reversals. The servant's life and his treatment and Yahweh's judgment of him is the most dramatic instantiation, manifestation, example of that reversal. And then, post-reversal, then you imagine a line of people who start to recognize. And a question arises, okay, so it's bleak and nobody recognizes. Then God acts and people start to recognize. Who were the first order people to start to recognize? And that's where Isaiah's message starts to take over. The lepers, the sinners, the poor, the weak, the outcast, the abandoned, the people that he represented. They're the first. They become the first in the line. And the oppressed, the mistreated, the crushed ones, the humiliated ones, they're the first. You know, if you are a leper and you read about Moshe, for example, you hear these stories about people who are holy. You read about these people, or if you're a bastard, or if you are an oppressed person that's been outcasted, and you hear about holy men, you don't feel like he's one of ours. This servant figure is going to be depicted as one of ours for the outcast. It is, in that sense, that's the arm of Yahweh being revealed. That from Isaiah 1, where he starts out and says, you guys have crushed my heart. You bring so many sacrifices, and you call yourselves holy, and you bring all this stuff in my presence, and you maintain the jot and tittle of my Torah in regards to sacred space. But you grind the face of the poor, and you have blood on your hands because you murder the innocent. You guys are crushing my heart. You don't understand me. You don't get me. So I'm going to reveal me to you. And you won't even see it. But when you do, you'll understand who I side with. The servant reveals this. And so there's this idea. Now here's a part that should touch our hearts. As we've built a bridge where we start to understand Isaiah's message about the servant. We can then bridge to its fulfillment. We live in a day where we live past the days where these events have taken place. But here's a question. A lot of people read this like it's a fucking historical relic. When they read our message and who has believed, they think of it like in the long ages past. They think the our message is restricted to just Israel a long time ago. And then the question becomes, well, whose message is it? Has it expired? Who has ownership of the message? Because they say our message, Lishma Otenu. This is what's interesting. Lishma Otenu, because it's the idea of, because Lishma Otenu touches on the verb shomeo for hearing, it would mean they are witnesses. It's not simply a secondhand report. Witnesses are speaking about the servant. Do you understand? So then the question becomes, well, who's a witness of the servant? Because the servant died, but is raised again and then exalted and still interacts from a ruling position, anybody who witnesses the servant, it becomes their message. Because Yeshua of Nazareth is the Mashiach that this prophesies, he is the servant that was prophesied. And because he was struck down and killed, but raised to die no more, and because he still speaks and reveals himself, he still reveals the arm of Yahweh, which is himself, to people. It's your message. If you make contact with that risen servant that God spoke about in verse 13, now it's your message. It's yours.
So I was thinking that the hour could refer to Yahweh and the servant's message, and which the message is, I am going to show myself, revealing the arm of Yahweh in himself as a poor, broken down, homeless, beaten guy that wasn't accepted by religious figures, etc. And because he reveals himself that way, so that people that are in that position, that have been outcast their entire lives, they can relate and see / hear his message. So once we accept the message, it's almost as if we were stricken down and raised again through him.
Yes.
So that's why it's my message as well as his.
It's a deep dynamic. I love it because you see this problem in mathematics where it's like, where do I plot the points, and from what vantage point do I build the plane? There's infinite ways to look at it. Now, I'm not trying to gobbledygook it.
Yeah.
I will say what you're saying is permissible within the content of Isaiah, because Isaiah 22, it talks about a sword comes out of my mouth. You made my words sharp. You tell me what to say. Isaiah 49 says, I rise up early and I'm your pupil, the servant. You put words in my mouth. There is a message that the servant has and that Yahweh has. Let's think of it this way, though, okay? Because they're not at odds with each other. They're just different parts of the process. Let's think of that process so that we can visualize it right now. Okay, so I'm going to draw that process for us.
Yeah, they're not in opposition to each other. They're
complementing,
just complementary. Yeah.
In a single process. And here's how that is. Let's do it like this. Okay, we have that, and we're going to say, okay, yeah, and we're going to say, we have this, we'll do that, there you go, and this is the servant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is the servant. Them together, Yah giving to the servant doing actions in accordance with what Yah gives and arranging himself. Together, this interaction, these comprise the authorship or orchestration of the events of the message. Do you understand? Because the message is testimony, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's witnessed. What is witnessed? And who authored it and who caused it? Well, Yah and the servant in cahoots, in collaboration, in conjunction. We know that from 22. We know it from Isaiah 22, Isaiah 11, Isaiah 49. All kinds of places. These two are going to be, they're in cahoots. And the servant will often proxy for Yah, okay? And he's anointed for that purpose, to judge. He doesn't judge based on what his eyes see and his ears hear. I just missed my cry. He judges based on that connection. He's the and so the authorship and orchestration of the events of the message are this. But then you have another. What you end up having is this is witnessed, right? So let's imagine that you have these onlookers, right? These activities are witnessed. Understand? They are, let's do this so it's a little clearer. Okay, and we can see here, you can imagine that. You can also imagine a kind of, that the whole thing is like the whole message is heard, right? Do you understand? Because it is words. There are words involved. There is instruction. There is Torah. Do you understand?
Mm.
And the core of what is seen, and what is heard, the message, these are witnesses. Do you understand? Witnesses see and hear the words and actions of the servant in cahoots with Yahweh. When witnesses decide to, like, you imagine, let's imagine that you're holding someone else's hand. You're the servant, you have Yahweh's hand. And then I'm a witness, and then I say, I want to collaborate as a witness with you. It's our message. I'm not the author of it. I'm just the recipient.
Yeah.
Right? But it is still our message. Do you see how they're not at odds? Do you see how they're together? And it is interesting. Yours is deeper because it's the idea that one way to get there too is how could it become our message? It could be our message in a kind of metaphorical relating. When I encounter the message, I relate to it. But that is highly subjective, individualized, and personal. Not to say that it couldn't still be that another way, but it's isolated to just me, and it eradicates the idea of a witness. That way would eradicate.
No, wouldn't God do the witness?
It would be fine if God wanted to have a courtroom with only God there. The Torah is built on the idea of every matter being established by the testimony of 2 to 3 witnesses, right? And here's the thing. The question is this, does God entrust this thing that he has authored with the servant, and the message of the words and the servants and the actions, that the words that the servant speaks and the actions the servant does, that Yahweh has authored? Does God entrust that to witnesses to take it to Israel?
Yes.
Okay. Then the question becomes, by extension, because the servant doesn't die anymore. He died already, but was raised and then is exalted to a position. Are they just sitting there, or are they still working toward the same goals?
They need us to keep telling their message.
But their message is based on witnesses. So here's the question. Does the arm of Yahweh being revealed stop happening, or does he keep revealing it through this servant who's exalted in verse 13?
It keeps going.
If you haven't had any contact with Yeshua of Nazareth, and he has testified to you through power, healed you through his message, or done something, you made some kind of contact internally and transformed you. You are now not just a recipient of healing, you were a witness of the servant.
His arm.
You're a witness to the arm of Yahweh. The expiration date of this union right here, right? The expiration date of this picture of Yah and the servant.
No.
It would until
the servant comes back.
Until the servant dies, and the servant's not going to die. So
correct.
It's never.
Yeah.
And so this idea is they're still at work. And then the question is, well, what's their work? The same work that Yahweh's talked about in the beginning of Isaiah, which is insane because one of the ways he's going to bring in the Gentiles who were excluded. Think about it. The last verse of 52. Those who were not told, those who did not see, will be told. They'll be accounted to them. Those who did not hear, they will understand. They'll be brought in as witnesses to Israel. In other words, God's desire from the beginning of chapter 1 is, I want Israel's heart. I want my people's heart. They're riddled with brokenness from the Nachash, the serpent, and outside influences. But we find that as God's heart unfolds, his broken heart for Israel unfolds. His heart is bigger and still broken yet, and he wants the Gentiles. And he uses this riddle and this parable of the servant's life to draw in even the Gentiles. And part of their drawing in is, pick up the task that I had in the first place. I know that you didn't care about the Jewish people, but now that I've brought you in, help me get my people as witnesses, right? And this is like Romans 11. The way that we have walked through 53:1, I would say it does a better job of increasing and maximizing exegetical scope for Romans 9 to 11. You're like, what the hell are you talking about? Romans 9 to 11 is a passage that a lot of people squabble over, fight over, and even use as a kind of like badge of honor for how they understand the gospel. Okay? And I will say that Romans 9 to 11 ought to be given a kind of important place of primacy. It's just how do we interpret it?
Yeah.
And in these passages, Paul quotes in these sections, okay, in 9 to 11, he's going to quote this verse, literally. He quotes this verse, and he quotes a verse in 52:7, or he quotes 52:7.
In 52:7.
And one of the things that we have here too is this idea that there would be news. The message is something that's witnessed that is good news. Okay, which is where we get the word euangelion, gospel in Old English, which is how we inherit it. Good news that is supposed to have a result. Good news that is itself a call to faithful obedience, a call to faithfulness and obedience to the servant, a call to join God and the servant in their faithfulness through giving faithfulness, judging the servant as faithful and giving allegiance to the servant.
And not to go off in this direction, but at the same time, it was not good news to everyone.
Bingo. So this idea of good news, in Hebrew, it's basar. So we can do Isaiah 52:7 just as a side note so we can wrap up Romans 9 to 11 and this verse. Basar, basar tov, good news. It's a militaristic phrase. It's kind of dark. The word basar is used for good news. You know what else basar means? Flesh or meat, sometimes corpses. It becomes metonymy or associated with when one king has defeated another king and the battlefield is littered with defeat.
Mm-hmm.
They're ours for the taking. They're just meat now. That's all that's left. It's the good news that one king has conquered another king. Mm. So if you were on the side of the winning king, it's good news.
Yeah.
If you're on the side of that other guy, it's not good news. So that's part, and also we're going to see as the servant song works itself out. It's bad news for people who misjudge the servant already, just at the outset. But it doesn't have to stay bad news for them so long as they accept him as an Asham. But if they insist on maintaining that evil judgment, it's just terrible. It goes from bad news to worse news to terrible news, because this person that they insist on fighting and hating is actually judged by God as faithful, risen to his right hand, and it's
digging yourself a deeper hole.
Digging themselves a deeper hole. That's a great way to say it. There's no way out of that hole except to look at the servant.
I would say people in that position would never do. It's almost impossible for them to.
It is almost impossible, except for the weirdness of the servant, because the weirdness of the servant proves that from heaven, God will go down into our holes. If you follow the servant will make you go down into other people's holes. Yeah. So whoever the our is, our message, we'll have to copy this servant. One of the problems with the servant to Westerners, I would say, one of the immediate problems that arises from surveying the works of the servant is going to be that everything the servant does, it will be expected for his followers to seek to replicate and go after him. Now, it doesn't mean they'll be shoulder to shoulder with the servant. He will be ahead of them and exalted above them.
They should be chasing after him.
Bingo. He has carved a path, the only path, for others to walk to shalom, to safety, to healing.
Going across rocks and thorns and mountains and valleys if you don't take that path.
Well, another way to say that is impassable.
Yeah.
Not just painful, it's impassable and impossible apart from this way that will be opened up. Indeed, the idea that there is a way that will be opened up is a repetitive idea in Isaiah. And part of the reason is why do they obsess over the road back? By the way, what is the work of the servant? What Remember, in 52:10, who it talks about the arm of Yahweh being revealed, and then another Exodus event. They were trying to get back to Canaan because they were slaves in Egypt. They're trying to get back to their promised land. At the times that Isaiah is prophesying about, Israel will be scattered.
Mm-hmm.
This servant is going to come to make a path to get them back from many nations, a return from exile. So if you don't return on the path of the servant, there's no return from exile. In other words, some of what God is saying is, I know you want a return from exile. I desperately want you to come back from exile too.
You need to do it.
This is the only way I have afforded you to return from the exile.
Same way you got out of Egypt in the first place. You couldn't have just walking across the Red Sea.
Yeah. And
I made a way.
Yes.
If you went off, you're not going to make it.
Yeah.
You have to stay on this path.
Bingo. That's a great metaphor. He pioneers ahead of us, which is why the servant is sometimes synonymous with the arm of Yahweh. Sometimes the servant is depicted as the local Yahweh, pioneering ahead and leading, breaking the Red Sea, these kinds of metaphors. The other thing about this path that's interesting is there was no way, no path opened up when they faced the Red Sea, right? That's that metaphor.
Yeah.
Extending that metaphor, there was no way or no path afforded to the Gentiles. And yet Isaiah 29 talks about how I'll open up a way and a path, and I will make a way for the Assyrian and the Egyptian and another nation. I cannot remember, the Cushite or something, another nation, and they will be my people too. This way that will be opened up
It's open to everyone.
To everyone. But the catch is, we'll see in Isaiah 61, 62, 63, really 60 through 63, that Gentiles, their job is to bring Israel back. And they end up becoming, almost by carrying Israel like they are the vessels of Yahweh. Gentiles will be made into priests. God will cause Cain and Abel to make peace, because the ultimate Abel is going to be the servant. God will cause Ishmael and Yitzchak, Isaac, to be at peace. God will cause Esau and Jacob to be at peace. God will cause even the 11 brothers of Israel who reject the son of Israel, Joseph, and throw him in a pit to kill him, but later he's raised from the pit and raised to the right hand of the Gentile king and has all authority. Cause them to be at peace. There's this massive sweeping motion. And how? What path? Not many paths. One path. And this idea in Isaiah, it is all encompassing. It's very intricate how God draws people and calls them to that path, to be sure. The inroads of heralds and messengers calling to the path are manifold and many, but there's one path.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of the idea that when God works in the world, there are many paths to the top of the mountain, for example. No. So
There's
narrow.
many ways to the one path.
That's exactly what I was saying. You said it way more simply. There are many ways to the one path. But the path gets so fucking narrow. It's insane, actually. The path is literally the width of one man. Servant. And the only way to get through him is to give your allegiance to him. To not be disgusted by him. Many people will leave that path because that's where the path narrows to. Fuck him. He's disgusting. That's not me. That's not who I am. He's not the Messiah. Or I'm not that dirty. And they'll turn around. The path narrows to this one servant. Yeah, I love this passage, man. There's so much here for people who want to know the God of Israel. And it's fresh and it's alive for us today. So, do you have any other questions and any thoughts? Anything you want to add that you think would help somebody?
I think that was great. No, I don't.
All right. Sure, bless you guys. Let's do this. And